Welcome to week 3 of RAFF 6205. This is summer session A in 2020, and it's so good to be back with you. I have missed you in the time since we were together last week, and I hope you're enjoying the course as much as I am. I'm having a ball, and I hope that you do too. This week we're going to be talking about good laboratory practices, or GLPs, medical devices, and medical marketing. But before I do that, I want to get into a little bit of background about some upcoming deadlines that you need to be paying attention to. And the first of those is you should submit the topic of your legal evaluation and analysis paper by midnight Sunday. And then after that, the RIQ, or Rule, Issue, and Question Summary, is due by Sunday of week 5, followed by the meeting, the report of your FDA meeting or your FDA rule by week 6. And then we'll close out the assignments with the legal evaluation and analysis paper with an annotated bibliography by Sunday, week 7. There is information in your course menu in Blackboard about every one of these subjects. So be sure that you carefully read what you're supposed to be doing and be on time. And if there's a necessity for an extension, just let me know, and I'll work with you as much as I can. But let's go to work. And first thing we want to do is set the stage. I don't know about you, but I learn better going from the big picture down to the minutia. And what we're talking about pretty much for the rest of this course are what's called FDA good practices. And you'll see that abbreviated GXP, and then I've got a plural in the parenthesis in the first line on this slide. And the X will stand for the substantive area that we're talking about, like laboratories or manufacturing, etc. And the GXPs are actually suites or parts of FDA rules that govern areas that are regulated by the FDA. Let's take a look at some of those, because we're going to be covering one of them today, and that's laboratories. We're going to cover manufacturing later, along with clinical and then documentation good practices. So let's drill down a little bit into GLPs, or good laboratory practices. I have put for you in Blackboard in the weekly session for this week the federal rules governing GLPs, and you can find those at 21 CFR Part 58. Now, 21 is a title chapter of the enormous amount of federal rules, and Title 21 is devoted to FDA. CFR is an abbreviation for the Code of Federal Regulations, and that is the absolute source of rules governing the FDA. And then the part is number 58, and within 58 are individual rules governing GLPs, and we're going to look at some of those in a little bit of detail in just a moment. Now, these federal rules provide us with a framework governing laboratory studies, and notice the use of the word framework. What the government will do is say, here are the boundaries, y'all stay within the boundaries and you'll be okay. And these boundaries include parameters such as planning, performance, monitoring, archiving, and reporting. And if you look at those are pretty time sequenced. In other words, you got to plan and then perform, then you monitor, archive, and report. So let's take a look just to give you an overview of the lab study rule titles. And you notice I haven't animated this slide. And that's because all I would like for you to do is, as you hear me talking, just let your eye run down these chapter titles in the rules about non-clinical lab studies. And you'll see it's pretty logical. They start out with general and then the organization and then facilities, and it gets more specific, and it goes down to K, disqualification. That may be hard to read down there on the floor of this slide. But these are the rule titles. And I'm going to talk a little about each of these as we go through. But before I do that, I want to do a little bit more context work. Surprise, surprise. To really understand GLPs today, you got to go back to the early 1970s, which could best be understood as being the Wild West of clinical laboratory operation and cleanliness and sanitation. There were inadequate test systems. People were using non-standard calibrations. There were erroneous accounts of lab studies. There were fraud and poor lab practices nationally. And it really hit the fan the day the FDA walked in and found rodents infested in a clinical laboratory. And that's the springboard of GLPs. Now, here are their goals. And again, you notice that this isn't animated. So what I want you to do is look at these goals and look how legitimate and logical they are. Certifying validity of every step of the analysis, assure quality, integrity of data, record your data, and record and retain your specimens. I can't get much more logical than that. So that's the overview. Now let's drill down a little bit into GLP principles. And there's about a dozen of them. And these principles mimic the title chapters: facility, organization, and personnel, QA and facilities, apparatus, material, and reagents, test systems, substances plus reference substances, SOPs, performance and reporting, storage and retention, final report, and then inspection results to management. So the first principle has to do with facilities. And notice that these are not animated. Just look at the parameters of the principles having to do with size, construction, location, separation, isolation, suitable rooms, and storage. Pretty simple stuff, eh? GLP principles having to do with apparatus, material, and reagents. Look again how logical and understandable these are. An appropriate design and capacity. Documented. That's a key word in doing business with the government. Documented inspection, cleaning, maintenance, and calibration. Setting up your test systems so there's non-interference by one with another. And then labeling has to be done very specifically to indicate identity, expiration, and storage instructions. And of all of these principles that we've looked at in this slide, labeling is the one that is going to be the most precise that you do, because labeling will be key to inventorying, logging, locating, storing, destroying, and retaining materials in your lab. The next principle has to do with test systems, and whether it's physical, chemical, or biological. And look what's required for condition records: the source, the arrival date, and the arrival condition. Identification of containers, container cleaning and sanitization records, and documented pest control agents. Remember the picture of the rat a minute ago? The next principle has to do with test and reference substances. Here again, you want to have receipts for handling, sampling, and storage. And those receipts need to characterize what's on those receipts. You want to have principles governing the stability of test and reference items, test items, and experiments and analytical samples for each batch. You knew this was coming: standard operating procedures. These are common in industries, especially in healthcare. These are written policies, procedures, and forms for protocol-specific activities, and they're going to be common in every industry. And what those are the book on the requirements of what to do and when and how for protocol-specific activities, such as chronological action steps and explanations how procedures are to work. Study plan content for performance needs to look at this, how logical. Identification, the records, the date, the test methods, and the sponsors, and then a discussion of how the study was conducted. Those results need to be reported and need to mention the sponsor and the facility, the start and completion, the program statement, the materials, test methods, results, and where the stuff is now. And talking about where it is now, there are GLP principles regarding storage and retention. And retention has to do with keeping materials on hand, and you'll want to be aware of the appropriate statute of limitations governing the industry where you're working and the materials you're working with, because you're going to need to retain the materials at least as long as the statute of limitations. So when you're talking about storage and retention, you need a study plan about raw data and samples, inspections, schedules, procedures, maintenance, calibration, disposal, and most helpful of all, a detailed index. So that's kind of a overview from a high level of GLP principles. Now I want to move over into medical devices, and the first thing I want to do is just remind you that when we're talking about medical devices, which are things, they are things that you can hold or handle. There are ever so many terms of art involving medical devices. And the first bullet item I've put up here is drawn from the definition of a medical device. It includes an instrument or an apparatus, an implement, a machine, a compliance, an implant, or an in vitro reagent, or other similar or related capital D defined terms. Now, we're going to look at some defined terms in just a moment. But when you start delving into the area involving medical devices, always, always, always keep in mind that the words in the rules are going to use words of art. And words of art are usually defined terms, such as capital D drug. And these are not capitalized because they're first words. They're capitalized because they're words of art. And I'm just letting you scroll through these so you can get an idea of what some of the words of art are. Get the picture? So these are not conversational words. These are defined words. So let's take a look a little bit. And this is probably one of the most specific slides we're going to have, because I want you to completely understand and be comfortable with your knowledge of what a medical device is. And the way I've animated this slide is I'm going to bring up line by line some language taken directly from the rule, and within the each bullet point you're going to see information highlighted and bolded in red typeface, and I'm doing that to help you learn and to help you remember what a medical device is. So when we think about a medical device, and I've already introduced you to the first clause, a medical device is an article, A-R-T-I-C-L-E. Notice it in red. And the kind of article is an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component, part, or accessory, which is. Now that's my cue to tell you that the definition of a medical device is a multifaceted definition. So the first step is it an article? And if it is, then we go to the next part of the definition. Is it a recognized article? And where it's recognized really counts, because articles, medical devices, are recognized in the official national formulary or the United States Pharmacopoeia or any supplement to them. So we've got two basic sources to go to, and always check their supplements to see if the article is recognized. So we got article that is recognized, and then how is it used? And the rule specifies that it is intended for use, what? In the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, where? In the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, or it's intended to affect the structure of any function of the body of man or other animals. Now those are what's within the definition of a medical device. It's an article, it's recognized, diagnosis of disease, to cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, and it is intended to affect the structure or function of an individual or other animals. But there's some exclusions from this definition, because a medical device is not intended to achieve its primary purpose through chemical action within or on the body of man and other animals, and is not dependent on being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. Now, I'm not going to apologize for going through this so carefully and so meticulously, but I hope you remember article recognition, diagnosis of disease, and affect structure or any function, not through chemical action or being metabolized. And then you'll have a really good understanding of a medical device. When we're thinking about medical devices in the context of the FDA, one of your questions ought to be, well, what involvement does the FDA have with medical devices? And I've listed several of them up here, and again, they're pretty much sequential in their presentation, but they got to be registered, listed, pre-marketed, classified, determined to be compliant, and then they need to be labeling. So these are pretty much typical activities for an FDA subject: registration, listing, submissions, classification, conference of compliance code, and labeling. So let's spend just a minute or two on medical device marketing, because what we've talked about so far is very precise information, but when we start talking about marketing, you're getting into the area where there's more of an artistic approach. And medical device marketing is, of course, subject to the Drug and Cosmetic Act and a suite of federal rules. Now look, I want you to look at the citation in this second bullet point, because I have already referred you to 21 CFR Part 1 through 58. And those rules are in this week's Blackboard materials as a resource. But look at the second part of this citation where it says parts 800 to 1299. That citation is also in your Blackboard materials, and it, folks, is a treasure trove for you, because when you're going through the Blackboard materials in resources in this week's session materials, click on the link for 21 CFR 800 through 1299, and up is going to come a literal index of FDA rules that will take you almost anywhere you want to go. And if you've got a capability of storing that link on your computer, you're going to find it invaluable, not only for this course, but also in your work. Medical device marketing also covers medical devices that emit radiation that itself is subject to regulations for radiation emitting electronic products. Now, I brought up this third bullet point because your discussion boards for the rest of the term are going to involve working with a device that emits radiation. So I wanted to introduce you to that topic to clue you that you need to look at those regulations, because they're going to be implicated in discussion board materials. Pre-marketing. What do we do before we market? Well, it's got to be classified. We've got to choose the correct pre-market submission, because there's several ways to submit a pre-market item. we've got to prepare and submit the application, and for goodness sakes, interact with FDA staff during the review. I put this last bullet point on here because I don't want you to be surprised if after you do a submission that you're contacted by the FDA. You ought to plan on it, prepare for it, and be ready for inquiries and responses to the FDA during the review process. Then you'll want to complete your registration and your device listing. I mentioned categorizing medical devices, and there's 3 categories, and it starts with number 1, which is the lowest risk, and it's subject to general controls. An example of a class 1 medical devices is a manual toothbrush, for goodness sake. So the controls on a class 1 medical device are very general. Now, class 2 has got some moderate risk, and those would be subject not only to general but special controls. And an example of a class 2 device is something like non-invasive blood pressure monitors. Class 3 are the highest risk, and they have general and special controls. And a class 3 device is a heart valve, for example. So you got 3 categories, 1 through 3, 1 being the lowest and 3 being the highest. And the higher you go, the more stringent the controls are. We talked about pre-market submissions. The easiest is to do what's called a 510K pre-market notification. This is the equivalent of a registration, and what you do is you've got a device that's substantially equivalent to a device that's already been approved by the FDA. But you've got a slight wrinkle that warrants your product, so you register it with the FDA using the 510K pre-market notification. If you've got something brand new, this is the most stringent type of pre-market submission. It's called a PMA, pre-market approval. And that's where you have to go in with all your evidence, all your work, and demonstrate to the FDA that it's appropriate, it's been tested, it's safe, and it meets all the registration requirements. A de novo is a brand new device. It doesn't have any kind of a predicate. It's a brand new item, and that's stringent also. And there's an exemption that you need to know about for a pre-market submission, and that's a class 3 device intended to benefit patients with rare diseases, which brings to mind whether or not any of the current exploratory devices for the present coronavirus pandemic might fall in the humanitarian device exemption category. So that's a look, folks, at GLPs and a little bit about medical devices, some takeaways, and how predictable these takeaways are. You need to understand the GLP and medical device FDA requirements and then implement their practices, both for GLP and medical devices. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about, let me pull it up so I can read it for you, good clinical practices and tobacco products. And then I'm going to add to our curriculum, because I'm going to cover next week in the final part of my lecture, compliance plans. I don't think it's fair for me or any other professor teaching a topic that the breach of which can get you in trouble. I don't think it's fair unless we accompany that teaching with an ability to keep out of trouble, and if you get into trouble, to mitigate your penalties. So I'm looking forward to next week. In the meantime, I hope you have enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.